I mentioned that I've been practicing and learning Excel recently, and in a little bit we're going to try something different. I'm going to show you one or two spreadsheets that I've done that have to do with my project here that I think are rather revealing when you put the information together in that way, you get a bird's eye view. But first I wanted to mention something that came across my desk. I, as I've mentioned, am a member of Academia EDU Online, and of course I've written about Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven, and so I get other people's papers that come to me by email every once in a while from this same service. And I got one today. This is a paper entitled Arguing Slavery's Narrative, Southern Regionalists, Ex-Slave Autobiographers, and the Contested Library Representations of the Peculiar Institution, 1824-1849. It's by somebody named Calvin Schermerhorn, and it was printed in the Journal of American Studies in 2012 by the Cambridge University Press. Okay, so this quote comes from Poe's review of Paulding's Slavery in the United States and Drayton's The South Vindicated. Presumably he's referring to James Kirk Paulding and William Drayton. Paternalistic master-slave sentiments, Poe argued in the Southern Literary Messenger, quote, belong to the class of feelings by which the heart is made better, because they grow by the habitual use of the word my, used in the language of affectionate appropriation. And there's ellipses. He who is taught to call the little Negro his, in this sense, and because he loves him, italics, shall love him, italics, because he is his. So I'm going to read that last again. He who is taught to call the little Negro his, in this sense, and because he loves him, shall love him because he is his. This is the same convoluted BS logic that one finds in the philosophy of composition. I wasn't able to find it. I was trying to look this thing up. What I did was to read a couple other of Poe's reviews because I try to be fair. It's difficult to read these things, but I try to be fair when I criticize someone, and I haven't read that many of Poe's reviews. So I did, and what I found is that he's erudite and he's sharp, he's very smart, and he's able to pick things apart, pretty well. He always ends up being better than the other guy. There's an arrogance behind it, to where he can accurately see the flaws and the good points, but he ends up trashing it. Not always, but near as I can tell, for the most part, he ends up finding something, fatally wrong with it, which makes him look like he's quite superior to the person that he's reviewing, So I think I was right. I mean, I would have to read a whole lot more, but that's certainly my impression. Anyway, we're going to leave that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my research method, and then I'm going to show you these results. Now, when I talk about my research method, I mean proving Matthew Franklin Whittier's authorship of various works, because he wrote almost everything anonymously. There's two pseudonyms that I absolutely can prove were his, 100% in the historical record. There's several others that I can prove by what you'd call a preponderance of the evidence. And the rest of them I have to make a case for. And I have done that in my books and in my papers, particularly in my books, the long way. But still, I have to ferret that out. And unfortunately, what I found was that by these methods, I would identify a particular pseudonym as Matthew Franklin Whittier's, and then I would do due diligence and Google lines and Google things, and I would find that it was claimed by somebody else. And this happened a bunch of times, 15, 20 times, maybe, 15 times anyway, that I would find out it was claimed by somebody else. Things that had I been a real scholar, educated scholar, in a university, I would have known those things. But in a way, it's just as well that I didn't, because knowing that it was Matthew's work by these other methods, I continue to pursue it. Whereas if I had been a scholar who had been trained, for example, that Margaret Fuller was the one that wrote as a star in the New York Tribune, had I been told that and taught that in college, I never would have pursued it in the first place. So here's the method that I used, roughly. I just kind of made this list quickly. First is, of course, by style, and also by internal recognition, whether I feel that that was mine or not. Now, sometimes those two things conflict, and that happens when the author was an imitator. This happened a lot in the 1851, 1853 carpetbag, that those writers, because they were trying to fill up an 8-page paper every week, the editor let them run wild imitating Matthew, and they did. And I sometimes looked at these imitations and said, boy, that looks like Matthew. And it turned out not to be. Well, my intuition wasn't really working in that case, but most of the time it did work. Now, another thing I would do is, because Matthew was writing under different pseudonyms in different papers, and he often brought in, especially in his travelogues, he would bring in personal elements about where he was, or he would write a letter and he would say Boston, May, whatever, or he would sometimes give the full date, May 3. And in the travelogues, he would say where he had been and where he was going to. He would give an itinerary. So you can cross-reference these things, because I can look at a travelogue that was, for example, in the Boston Weekly Museum, where he says that he was in Washington, D.C. I'm just pulling these off the top of my head. And then I can look in the Portland transcript, where he was also contributing as a different pseudonym, say as a Star, or Ethan Spike, his known character. And I could say, well, was he in Washington, D.C., or was he reporting? So there's an example where in the carpetbag in 1851, 1852, he says he's in Washington reporting, and he's got an actual report from Washington and then a lampoon of a report from Washington. And then you can look and see, well, where does he say he was in the Portland transcript? And they match up. But he would not let them match up point for point a lot of times. So if he went to Portland, Maine to see his second family and made a side trip, he wouldn't mention that in the first one. He'd say he went to Washington. And in the second place, he'd say he went to Portland. But if you look at the dates, there's a nice big gap of about 5 days that he could have made a little side trip over to Portland. I mean, the trains were relatively fast there. So it all lines up, So that's just another way I can do that. And of course, I'm looking for instances in which it's absolutely impossible. And then if it's impossible, I have to say, is there some reason why Matthew would have lied? Is there some other reason? And occasionally there was. If he was trying to hide from his pro-slavery enemies, he might have lied. And he did on a few occasions to throw them off, which makes things immensely more difficult. But there's some that I can't explain that way. And I have to say, this can't possibly be Matthew Franklin Whittier, because he can't have been in two places at the same time, and there's no explanation as to why he would have lied about it. So that's a second, like a double check on the first, on the style and recognition. And the third one is pretty much I've covered, and that is contradictory sentiments. If there's anything in a piece that's flat out contradictory for Matthew's authorship, it means one of two things. It means either this is not Matthew, and that happened in the examples with the imitators. They would say something that Matthew would never have said, something cruel to animals, something pro-slavery, whatever it was, it couldn't be Matthew. So that's one explanation. Another one, and I think I only found this maybe one or two times. It's not very common. But occasionally somebody, some Southerner, for example, would steal one of Matthew's pieces and rewrite it with prejudiced, racist elements. See, he would tack on an introduction that was racist or pro-slavery, and the rest of it was Matthew's. And I could recognize that. Very disturbing to find a thing like that. And I feel that that's what disturbed Matthew more than anything else, is when that happened, because it made him look like he was pro-slavery, see, and his talents were being used for the enemy. Now, there's also persistent themes. Matthew was embarrassed about his long nose, and he would comment about that. He would write about a character with a hugely long nose, or he would write about noses, or essays and editorials and things. So that's just one theme. There's others. He was not in favor of nationalism, of overblown patriotism that was being used for the wrong reasons, to drum up support for an imperialistic war, things of that nature. He was raised Quaker. I've never seen this anywhere, but I get the impression that Quakers really did not bow to country. They worshiped God, but they did not believe in worshiping the country that they happened to be in. And Matthew kept that view. even though he was no longer a Quaker as an adult, because they had disowned him when he married outside the faith. He was, of course, anti-imperialism. And then another theme is his courtship with Abby. After her death, he wrote a great deal about that. And the poem Lady Geraldine's Courtship, which is supposed to have been written by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, was actually his account of his courtship with Abby, young courtship, when she was tutoring him. There's other certain writing conventions that he used. Now, lots of people use these. They don't necessarily mean in and of themselves that Matthew wrote the piece, but when he wanted to hide the name of a person or a town, he would give the first initial and draw a line. So Poyan would be P line, that's Abby's maiden name, or a town of Methuen would be M dash, or Rock's Village would be R dash. And he also liked to open with quotes, and there's certain people that he liked, like Byron and Shakespeare, that he used quite heavily. He used quotes in line. He put his puns in italic, and he also used the royal we quite a bit. So I look for those things, and conversely, I look for contraindications along those lines. Now, another thing he did, I've mentioned, is he would take a piece with one pseudonym, and he knew all of these editors, and maybe he knew the typesetters as well, but he would make arrangements to put these pieces on the page right next to each other, or one above the other. And in the case of a poem, if he started out with a poem and then ran this piece of his own, the poem might not be from him. It might not be his poem. It might be something that he liked, which informed the piece underneath. So he would juxtapose these different pieces in such a way that it was meaningful, that one informed the other. And aside from that, them all being together told you that Matthew was the author of all of them. So if you know, like Ethan Spike is Matthew's, the historians agree on that. But then he might put something right next to it that was signed with a star or some other pseudonym, and it would put you on notice, So I learned the hard way, because I kept going back and finding these things or noticing them when I was going back through it. I'd say, always look around on the page. If you find one of Matthew's, look next door, look below, and see. Because a lot of times he would gang them together on the page. And then lastly here on my little list, he would repeat things that he liked and try to improve on them. So if he had a particular gag that he thought was exceptionally good, 5 years later in another paper, he might try to improve on it and bring the idea back. Not verbatim, but he would bring the idea back and rewrite it and work it into a piece, because I think he felt that newspapers are here today and gone tomorrow. And if they're never reprinted and never discovered again, that it was a shame that, a particularly good gag would be lost forever like that. So he'd bring it back and use it again. So that's some of my research methods. But now I'm going to get into some of these spreadsheets. And technically, I am not able to do any picture-in-picture right now with this. So I'm going to switch over, and you'll hear my voice, and we'll look at these spreadsheets. We're going to start out with this one. You will see the titles on the upper left, the expression search term. So these are expressions or misspellings that Matthew loved to use and would use repeatedly. See, we have up here like ardor, for example, which he used for after. So now we look at the top and we see the different publications that Matthew wrote for, roughly in date order. So let's look above here at Earth, which is the Yankee pronunciation of earth, and his rendering of it. And he always spelled these things the same way. With, at the very beginning, he might have spelled it a little different than he did later on. But in these examples here, he kept the same spelling for 50 years. And other imitators didn't do this. So they might have spelled earth, A-I-R-T-H, but then if they used ardor for after, they wouldn't spell that the same, necessarily. So if you see, for example, a piece with 4 or 5 of these, earth, ardor, critter, darter for daughter, fust for first, heavenly for heavenly, and they're all spelled with Matthew's typical standard misspelling, you got a pretty good sense that either this is one heck of an imitator, and there were 1 or 2 that really, like Charles Farrar Brown, that really stuck to it, or this is Matthew Franklin Whittier, so this is one way I can know that it's one of his works. Well, Earth has 75 instances throughout this 50-year career, starting right at the beginning, New England Galaxy, New York National Advocate, New York Inquirer. We're talking 1825 to 1828. He's using that. But then we'll move forward with Earth. And you can see in the New York Transcript, we're getting into 1835. Constellation is 1832. New York Transcript is 1834-35. Portland Transcript starts around 1843 or so and moves all the way to the end of his career. That's 22 times. That's Ethan Spike primarily. Yankee Doodle is 47. Flag of Our Union, which was stolen from him by Francis Durivage and George Burnham, 4. The Chronotype, we're talking the mid to late 1840s, that's 9 instances, 1 in the Odd Fellow, 11 in the Weekly Museum, which is 1848 to 1852. Carpetbag is 51 to 53. There's 4 there. And, we move all the way across. Here we've got Vanity Fair. That's 1862, 1863. There's 3 examples of Ethan Spike using Aerith there. Now, here we've got kind of an interesting one. This is instances of Aerith that came from Francis Durivage and George Burnham's compilations, the books that they put together that were compilations of the pieces that they had stolen from Matthew's portfolio. There's 5 instances there. And then there's 2 of other papers. And we've already seen that the Flag of Our Union had, 4? Flag of Our Union has 4 Aeriths. So then we look over here and we find that there are 9 instances that showed up in Francis Durivage and George Burnham's stolen works from Matthew Franklin Whittier. And then next door we find that take that 9 from the total and there's still 66 that were Matthew's. And this is typical that you'll see 39 were in Matthew's work and 17 were stolen by Durivage and Burnham. 4 were Matthew's and 2 Columbi's were stolen. 92 critters spelled with ER, and 14 of them showed up in Durivage's and Burnham's work. Critter with a UR, 7 for Matthew, 3 for Durivage and Burnham. Darter for daughter, 17 in Matthew's works. 5 were stolen. And this is typical. Fust for first, 107 times, 107 pieces Matthew used that, but it still showed up in 12 of the ones that Francis Durivage and George Burnham stole. So this is a pretty strong indication that was not their work, that it was Matthew's work, especially when you go on and on and on, Here we have Lidl for little. 88 pieces Matthew used Lidl in, but 18 of the ones that Durivage and Burnham stole have it. And remember, this is the exact spelling. Now here we have, this is natur for nature, N-A-T-U-R. Matthew spelled it 2 different ways. But the second one, there's 28 in Matthew's pieces, but there were 10 that showed up in the Durivage and Burnham. So the thing is that Durivage and Burnham were using all of Matthew's, exact spellings, exact misspellings, because they just copied it over from him. They didn't write any of that stuff, or very, very little of it. So that's an interesting thing you can pull out of this. I'll go through some of these. 240 is a racing term. I guess it's 2 minutes, 40 seconds. And it was written different ways as 2.40, 2-40, and so on. And then it was also written out as 240. We have that down here, I believe. Yeah, 240. Not very much, just once, Once one of them shows up in Durivage and Burnham and one by Matthew. Now, Julia, this is a little interesting. Now, there's 2 possible explanations for this, but it shows up, the name Julia shows up as a character name in 36 of Matthew's works. And then if you get down to the end here to look at the Durivage-Burnham comparison, 14 of those were in the material stolen by Durivage and Burnham, and 22 were in the pieces published by Matthew. So I think the explanation is that Abby, as a young lady in her teens, didn't like her name, Abby. It wasn't French. It wasn't melodious to her. Also, an English nurse was called an Abigail, and there's some mysterious stuff going on as to her being named after the local doctor's wife. There's something very strange going on with that. I'm not sure exactly what it is. I have some theories, but at any rate, she may not have liked that and wanted to change her name. And there were two names that she thought were melodious, and one of them was Juliana or Julia, and the other was Adeline or Adela. And when Matthew writes and surreptitiously is referring to her and to incidents in their life, he uses those two names. Now, when he talks about her as a little girl, occasionally he'll bring in Mary, but almost always it's Julia, Juliana, Adela, or Adeline. So I think that's why Julia shows up so many times in Matthew's works. 36 of his pieces had a character, and this is a protagonist. And it's clear that it's autobiographical stuff about his relationship with Abby. See, that this character Julia represents Abby in these different anecdotes. Now, the other explanation is that it was generic. Now, I know that Jonathan was a New Englander, see, and when you wanted to talk about a New Englander, you called him Jonathan, and that name, I haven't totaled it up, but it's all through Matthew's work. It's possible that Julia was the female equivalent of Jonathan. If that's the case, then I would have to modify my theory here. But anyway, you see that it's quite often. Here we have night of the, that's what I searched on. What this means is a way to refer to anybody who's a professional in some profession. For example, a tailor would be the knight of the shears, and an artist would be the knight of the pen, see, and so on, and it went on like that. Well, Matthew loved this phrase. He used it 24 times in 24 different pieces. Now, let's see if there's any correlation here with Durivage and Burnham. One. But, I don't think people use that often. Some of these were in popular usage, and I think some of them were not so much. I haven't seen Knight of the Shears or Knight of the Pen in very many of these other pieces that I've happened to look through. So that it even shows up in one of the pieces that Durivage and Burnham stole is pretty interesting. Some of these other ones here, Matthew talks about the Mutual Admiration Society. There's not very many examples. Liedel, obviously, is a huge amount, but I'm looking at his favorite expressions now, and not just his misspellings. Palladium. Palladium was the statue of Athena that guarded the ancient city of Troy, also Pallas. And he used, just spelling it correctly, he used it 6 times. But there's quite a few examples where he spelled it in a cartoonish way for Ethan Spike, so you'd have to at least double that. Fizz, for a face, 36 times. He liked that one. And Durivage and Burnham, 3. Matthew 33, if you take away the Durivage and Burnham, and they had it 3 times, just enough, see? And let's see. There's one up here, the elephant. Now, the phrase was seeing the elephant, but just to be sure I'd get it right, because Matthew would sometimes refer to it without using the word seeing, I just put in the elephant. I got 22 instances. So seeing the elephant meant that you'd gone to a place like New York City and you'd seen the best of the best, the most amazing thing that New York City had to offer. That was seeing the elephant. And he liked that phrase. Sublunary. Matthew liked the term sublunary, which means everything under the moon. I think it's something that he and Abby used to joke about. I found 13, but there's another 7 spelled sublunary, S-U-B-L-O-O-N-A-R-Y, and there's 2 or 3 that show up in the books. Plus, I don't know if I counted here the Raven, because in the edition of the Raven that Matthew submitted to American Review, it's in there, sublunary human being, or sublunary being, I think it is, and Poe changed it when he stole that poem and republished it and scooped Matthew by 2 days. He changed sublunary being to living human being, but he didn't know that it was one of Matthew's fond favorite expressions, see? So he really blew it when he modified that, for anybody that really understands what's going on. See if there are any other ones. Human face divine. That's a quote from, I think I wrote it down here, Paradise Lost. I wouldn't normally know that. I have to look up these things. The human face divine, he used that at least 9 times. Seems to me there's other examples, but 9. Hebdomadal, which means a periodical, used it 7 times. And does that show up in Durivage and Burnham? No, these do not. I think because that's not the kind of piece that Francis Durivage and George Burnham stole. They stole slapstick sketches or else kind of swashbuckling adventure stories. Neither one is likely to have that kind of word in it. Columbi means Hail Columbia. That's a reference to a patriotic song. Look at this one, Politics 14. See? I don't know if there's any Durivage ones of that. No, they didn't pick up on that one. So here we have Popkin or Popkins. Matthew liked that particular name. There were certain names that he liked, and one of them was Popkin or Popkins, and it shows up in 19 of Matthew's pieces. Now here's where you can really zoom in on something, and I think I'll get out of this mode. Now, in the Boston Weekly Museum, I'll put this up on the screen for you, there is a little kind of a message or a filler, and it's got a pointing hand symbol, starts out, and he says, "My good gracious, what are we coming to when people can take themselves apart?" exclaimed Miss Popkins upon seeing it announced on the Lyceum Theater bill that Mr. and Miss Nickinson would each appear in 3 pieces. It's signed F. Now, I know that Matthew used his middle initial F on occasion. He used it all the time in 1846 in the summer when he was undercover in New Orleans writing the police office reports, the police arraignment hearings in New Orleans. He signed F for that entire series. But generally, he would just pull it in every once in a while. For example, if he was signing with a star and he had something else on the same edition, on the same page or in the same edition, and he didn't want to have 2 pieces with the same signature in there, he would revert back to the F for that one. So this is Matthew signing as the F. He also signed as the F in the first 2 years of the Dial. That was not Margaret Fuller, the editor, signing for Fuller. That was Matthew signing for Franklin as F. But what we're going to do is to look at some of the pieces that were going along with it. See, I'm sorry, I have to look through my notes here, because it's a clue that tells us that Matthew was temporarily working or freelancing for the Boston Weekly Museum. So we're talking 1849. This is around June of 1849. That's when this comes out. It's in the June 9, 1849 edition. And this is a period when Matthew was laid over probably from his usual job as a postal inspector, and he would travel around, and it was probably a kind of a freelance job, per assignment type of job. And when he was laid over in Boston, he would sometimes clerk or act as an associate editor for the paper, the Boston Weekly Museum. And I think he did this for the Portland Transcript too. The significance of this is that he wrote unsigned little reviews. So, I have to have some basis other than style for claiming that Matthew could have written the review, see? And what I find is that he was actually working for these papers, and that's why he was in a position to write these little fillers. Well, during the same time, Matthew was publishing a series of philosophical, rather acerbic essays and ascetic essays under the name Peter Popkins. I've mentioned that Matthew's childhood nickname was Peter Pumpkin, and he used a whole slew of variations on this, like Peter Pumple and Peter Pendergrass and various things like that. So here we have F referring to Miss Popkins, and he is writing Peter Popkins. So Popkins actually shows up in the Durivage pieces once. There's a character with the last name of Popkins in there. Well, that's a pretty strong clue in itself. But let's look at what else is being published by Matthew during this period, because you get a sense of the different pseudonyms he uses and how I identify work as his. Above this, we have two. There's an asterisk, so he signed with a star in this paper in the June 2nd, 1849 edition. Below that is Bertram. I've mentioned that Bertram was a pseudonym that Matthew used. It's the narrator, the main male character in Lady Geraldine's Courtship, which Elizabeth Barrett, the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning, plagiarized from him. So that was one of his pseudonyms. We see it right in the issue directly before this F-signed mention here. Then PP, that's Peter Popkins. And below that is Down East in the same edition. That's a travelogue. One of his 3 or 4 travelogue identities was Down East, which means where I am here in Portland. Then there's the MIDS papers. I've written a paper about that. That's a satire of scholarly papers. It's a scream, actually. It's excellent. Then we have Peter Popkins again, and Bertram again, then Down East, and then there's B. Now, B apparently is short for Bertram. It's another, not exactly travelogue because he doesn't travel. He lives where I am right now in what used to be Westbrook. So he has a place in Westbrook. He's obviously very knowledgeable about poetry and about literature, and he writes these very erudite pieces, even though he sounds like he's retired in Westbrook. Well, Westbrook is very near Portland, where his estranged second wife and his children lived. So he had to have a place that he could go that was near where they lived and where he could bring the children to, like on a weekend or something when he visited. And that's apparently what this place in Westbrook was. So Matthew's literary identity when he was in Westbrook visiting his children was B. Now, B is significant because B comments on Edgar Allan Poe after Poe died and talks about having seen Poe recite The Raven in Boston in 1845 and hints broadly about, what Poe really was and what he was like, and he hints broadly as to why he was there. As I read between the lines, he sat right up in the front to try to rattle Poe, as he read The Raven and these other poems. So, and he said that Poe had unperturbable sang-froid. In other words, he wasn't flustered, which he wouldn't be with the kind of temperament that he had if he was a sociopath. So that's just a very small example of how I can pull evidence out of this material. And that's without really delving into the pieces and looking at the content. That's before I even read the content. Now let me briefly look at one of my other spreadsheets. This spreadsheet shows us all of Matthew's star-signed articles by paper. Well, I've got a mistake up here. I have to figure out what's going on with that. So it's showing the formula, and it's apparently got changed. Anyway, I won't worry about that. Here we have the carpet bag. This one is also in the carpet bag, and it's a case where Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber, the creator of Mrs. Partington and the other peripheral characters like Ike Partington, her juvenile delinquent nephew, he let Matthew write one of these pieces. And we know Matthew wrote it because it's signed with Matthew's star. And there's all of these pieces in the carpet bag. Then we get to the Boston Chronotype. That's the radical anti-slavery paper that Matthew wrote for. There's several star-signed pieces in there, including we've got poetry, we've got A Day at the Capitol, we've got, that's a carpet bag, excuse me. We've got Anniversary Week, epigram. It's mostly not big stuff. A temperance, a report on a temperance meeting and so on in the Chronotype. There's a poem, there's a humorous poem, and so on. Now there's one in the Courier, that goes back to 1829. That's the earliest one, August 11, 1829. Then we've got the Weekly Museum, that's a eulogy. Not a lot, just a little bit. The Weekly Museum continues. Then we've got the New England Magazine. We're early again. This is 1831. That's a poem, To Julia. That's a time when, it's a long story, but it appears that Abby had been turned against Matthew and lied to by her brother. And as a result, she turned a cold shoulder to him, and he wrote a poem about it, saying, well, if that's what you have to do, basically. And then there's a science fiction piece, a wonderful science fiction piece, which Matthew was writing before Poe did. That's 1832. And here in the New York Evening Mirror, 1847, there's a review. I just found the one, but he wrote as a star for the Evening Mirror in 1847. Then this Tribune, that's all of the work that's been mistakenly attributed to Margaret Fuller, which I won't go into. That goes from late 1844 to middle of 1846. Then we get into the Portland Transcript, and look at how many star-signed pieces there are in the Portland Transcript. We're starting with 1838, and we move on all the way to 1873. It's a eulogy. It's the very last one. And they're all different types. There's reviews. This one, Dread, is a review of a novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's incredibly good. And I wrote here, compare with reviews in the Tribune. It reads exactly like the star-signed reviews in the New York Tribune. And Margaret Fuller died in 1850, so we know by 1856 this was not her. And there's a great deal more in here in the transcript. Then we get to the Portland Tribune. There's 3 poems in there, or one little essay and 2 poems. They're deeply personal. They were, this one was published before Matthew remarried. Matthew was talked into an arranged marriage, apparently by his mother, kind of tricked into it, as near as I can tell. When I say tricked, the only way that Matthew would have married a woman sight unseen, a rather plain woman from Canada, sight unseen, is if his mother, who was in fact going to seances at this time, Mary Esther Carter was a friend of hers that was taking Matthew's mother to seances. She must have told him, oh, Abby came through and says you are to marry this woman from Canada. It's the only way he would have done it. So he was tricked into this second marriage, and it was a disaster. They had nothing in common. She was practical and materialistic, and she browbeat him. Anyway, that's a long story, but the very first thing that he wrote after Abby's death, Abby died in the end of March, and here it is nearing the end of August, and he writes one little essay on death. And of course, he believes that life continues. Then there's another poem. These 2 are very deeply personal, and I won't even go into them. They were published after he remarried in this obscure newspaper where I guess his new wife would never think to look. And they're about some of the deeply personal issues that he and Abby were dealing with toward the end of their marriage. I know what they are. Nobody else would ever have known who it was or what it was about. Then the essayist, we're now back to 1832. He signed a whole bunch of little reviews as a star. So he was reviewing as the star in 1832, years before he did it for the New York Tribune. And what I've done is to stack on the page. So this is like one batch, and that's one batch, and that's one batch, and so on. There's actually a lot more. Now here's the Oddfellow. That's like in 1846. These are in 47, and moving on to maybe 1850 or so. These are mostly just little short announcements. He was an Oddfellow. It's like the Masons when there was a new lodge opening or they had an anniversary meeting or something. He would report on it briefly, or he might report on the theater briefly, little reviews, but not big ones. And the last one is the Waverly Magazine, the August 27, 1853. It's a letter to the editor, and I've talked about this before. This is where Matthew reveals that he was the author of The Raven, one of several places. But in that publication in Boston, the Waverly Magazine, which Matthew normally wouldn't submit to, there was a dispute going on as to whether a fellow named Thomas Chivers, who knew Poe, had actually been the first to start using nevermore and things like that in a poem. And the presumption is that Poe took the idea from Chivers. Well, the reality is apparently that Matthew must have shared his work before he published it with both of these people. And the reason he would have shared with Chivers, who was a Southerner, Southerner who lived for a time in New York City, is that they were both Swedenborgians. They were both members of the Swedenborgian church. And Matthew would have met him on that wise and would have shared poetry with him. So both of them copied from Matthew. But Chivers was enough of a gentleman to just copy some ideas, whereas Poe stole the whole blasted poem. See? But Matthew writes in his typical code, but there's no question what he's saying, and that is, you all are wrong. I wrote the Raven. First he says Poe is an imitator, calls him a mockingbird, and then he says, no, I'm the one that's really original, which meant I was the one that wrote it. So here we are at 45 minutes. I'm going to have a lot of editing to do, and I don't feel that this was one of my better performances. I don't know that anybody will stick with it unless they're really interested. If you do stick with it, and if you are interested, I think you'll see how important this is and how powerful this actually is. Because when I say, Matthew Franklin Whittier used the star signature long before Margaret Fuller did and long after she died, it doesn't leave much of an impression unless you actually see it. When you physically see the thing right in front of you and you see how long I have to scroll through this thing and how many pieces, from 1829 to 1873, that was his secret go-to signature for years. And he published reviews. He was publishing reviews over that signature in 1832, 1833, see? So when I say that was his signature, that should be enough to make people seriously question whether Margaret Fuller was the star. See, that should be enough. And I've got Matthew in New York City several different ways, including his writing for the comic magazine, the Yankee Doodle in New York City, and, many other things. So Matthew is by far the more likely author just on that basis, the fact that was his signature. It was never Margaret Fuller's signature, see? So, and the way I know that he wrote as the F in the dial is because the star says so. The star refers to one of the pieces that was written for the dial and saying that was mine also, see? So we know that whoever was the star also wrote those F sign pieces in the dial because he says so, see? So this is how powerful this stuff is. And then when you get back to the first spreadsheet and we see these idiosyncratic terms that Matthew liked, hebdomadal, sublunary, and then we look at his spellings that he kept consistent for years and years, like earth, A-I-R-T-H for earth, and Lidl. Some imitators would use some of those things, but nobody kept as consistent as he did. And again, if you see a piece that you don't know the authorship, but you suspect Matthew, or it's been claimed by somebody else like Francis Durivage or George Burnham, and you see not one, but two or three or four, we see he refers to a face as fizz. He's talking about a big nose. He uses Lidl and Nater and earth, and then maybe he talks about a palladium. If you get enough of these things in there together, 4 or 5 of these unique indicators for Matthew, then the explanation of chance goes out the window. It's not going to happen because you can look at the imitators and you can look at other people that wrote during that era in similar genres, and you won't see those. You might see one if they're imitating Matthew. You might see Nature, that was pretty popular, but you won't see all of them, and you won't see the more obscure ones. So these are some of the ways that I do the research, and this is why these things are a lot more powerful than you probably think they are when I present them, and a lot more scientific, because we're now getting into the realm of actual objective research here. These things can be quantified, and they have been quantified in those spreadsheets. How many times did Matthew use Lidl? How many times does it show up in Durivage's and Burnham's pieces, and so on. And then further objective research could be done if somebody wanted to do a survey and how many people used these things. How common was it? How common were these exact spellings? How common was it to have 3 or 4 in the same piece with the exact same spellings? See? And eventually you eliminate everybody except Matthew Franklin Whittier. But then if that was Matthew signing as the star, in the New York Tribune, which it was, Then there's clues that show that he says Edgar Allan Poe stole the raven from me, which I presented recently in a recent entry. See, you know. So once you establish one, you then start to establish the next one and the next one. And the poems The Raven and the poem Lady Geraldine's Courtship have an almost identical line. If Matthew wrote The Raven, it's pretty much a done deal that he also wrote Lady Geraldine's Courtship, especially when you say the ridiculous lie that Elizabeth Barrett Browning told her mentor, Hugh Stuart Boyd, as to how she happened to supposedly write it. See, I'm not guessing about these things. This is good research. I am not, bless their hearts, I don't mean to be critical of them, because I kind of see them in the Facebook groups that I'm in, and I don't want to be disparaging, but I am not one of these people that decides that they were St. Paul or St. John or Joan of Arc or Cleopatra or, anybody famous, and they have hardly any evidence to show for it. Their evidence is things that you could have looked up, or their evidence is things that you can't look up. Now, there's exceptions to this, but I'm not one of those people. So if you jump to the knee-jerk, conclusion that that's what I'm doing and that's what I am, you just haven't looked into it. It's not a fair assumption, see? So, of course, this is at the end of the video, and nobody who's skeptical will ever get to the end of this video. So nobody who's that kind of a skeptic will ever hear this. So I have seen, for example, if you look at Matt Fraser's mediumship, there's no question that he's genuine. And occasionally, like he says, I love the skeptics, because he can blow them out of the water. And of course, here's the thing, they want him to be right. Deep down, they want him to be right because it'll mean that their father or mother or brother or sister or sweetheart are still alive, see? So deep down, they want it to be real. So their skepticism is relatively easy to overcome because they really want it to be real, and because Matt can just blow them out of the water in a matter of 15 or 20 minutes. By the time, he tells them the song that their mother sang to them as a baby, and, things that nobody would ever know and things that he couldn't possibly have looked up, online. One of them I just saw recently, I think it was the mother coming through, says, it's okay for you to get rid of my ties. You can let go of that now. And it turned out that they had already gotten rid of everything, but the only thing they kept was the ties. That was a father, excuse me. The father says, you can get rid of the ties now. And they'd gotten rid of everything, but they'd hung on to the ties. They couldn't let them go. So, I mean, when Matt does stuff like that, he can, and the people are skeptical, they're crying at the end. He's converted them. I can't do that for two reasons. First off, my evidence takes a lot longer. We're now at like 52 minutes. You have to hang out with me for 52 minutes and listen with an open mind to what I say before I can convince you, see? And secondly, you very much do not want what I'm saying to be true. It's just the opposite. People who have taught on Edgar Allan Poe for 30 years very much do not want me to be right about this. People who are fans of Edgar Allan Poe and feel that they've been inspired by him. They've been inspired by his poem, The Raven, which means they've been inspired by my past life poem, The Raven. But, these people do not want this to be true. And the same with A Christmas Carol and Charles Dickens. They very much do not want that to be true. The president of the Charles Dickens Association or the Charles Dickens Museum or the great-great-great-grandson of Charles Dickens very much does not want what I'm saying to be true. And likewise with the people who put out the movie about Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven that cost millions and millions of dollars to produce. They don't want this to be true either, because I'm blowing out of the water the entire premise of a film that cost millions and millions of dollars to produce, see? And likewise, the people that put on the plays of A Christmas Carol. Now, I've made one concession on YouTube where I put my links to my papers underneath the YouTube postings. I've decided that when there's a play coming up and they're advertising this December, they're going to put on such and such a play of A Christmas Carol, I don't post under that one because I don't want to affect their bottom line. I'll wait till after and then I'll post something. But if it's coming up and they're advertising it and they're all excited about it, I don't want to cut I mean, if everybody believed me, I might cut their, attendance by half, and it's tough enough running a theater without that. So I'm not totally cold-blooded about this, but I have something I need to accomplish, and that is that I have to reinstate Matthew Franklin Whittier and Abby Poyen Whittier's legacy. And, as I said, I would recognize these things and only later find out that somebody else was credited with it. I didn't want that, but having found out that Francis Durbage and George Burnham claimed all this work that I already knew was Matthew's before I ever found out who they were, I have to take it from them. And the same with Poe, and the same with Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and the same with Margaret Fuller, and the same with Charles Dickens. I have to take it away from them, you know. So that's what I'm about. There's a lot more to my research than the little bit I've been able to give by way of example here. If you read my books, Matthew Franklin Whittier in His Own Words, and the sequel, Matthew Franklin Whittier in His Own World, you will see point for point my research journey, how I got from one thing to another, to another, to another. It's all in there, and that's for posterity and for the sake of transparency. So scholars of the future, if I manage to preserve this work, can go back and see exactly how I discovered what and what led to what.